Happy Thursday, everybody. This is my pug. She is cute. I'd start this lecture by showing you a picture of my pug. Okay, so to avoid shaky cam, I'm going to start by pointing my phone at this particular BVT Lab slides. Okay, I had chapters 2 through 5 already recorded and posted on YouTube. I realized this one's the one I lack, so I'm going to redo this just for you guys. So maybe it'll be a little easier to follow along. Okay, we got the origins of psychology in chapter 1. We have our learning objectives. Describe how studying psychology can benefit you. Define psychology. Outline reasons why psychology includes the study of animal behavior as well as human behavior. And clarify how psychology arose out of philosophy and physiology. Outline the goals, list and describe the 6 major approaches, list and describe fields of specialization. So we already talked about giving the definition of psychology, state what we think psychologists do, explain why we should study psychology. The main reason I try to put forward, hey, we need to study psychology, is because we need to be more critical thinkers. We need to stop taking the information we're given at face value and start thinking about it. That's a lot of what these lectures teach. So we study psychology to understand the behavior of others, understanding our own behavior, thoughts, feelings, and attitudes, and evaluate the misconceptions present in popular media. Psychology is a scientific study of the behavior of humans and other animals. So we try to objectively define stuff by looking at things we can visualize, or rather see, and objectively define and measure variables and test them. Things that we can measure like heart rate, things that we can self-report on a little questionnaire. I can't look at someone and say, you're depressed, you're sad. No, I have to be able to figure out why. So while chemistry, biology, physics, and psychology are all sciences, they all use the scientific method, which we went over, that begins with making observations, forming a hypothesis, which is an if-then statement defining exact variables, designing an experiment to test that hypothesis using those exact variables, and forming conclusions from whether or not the hypothesis was supported by the experiment and the results. Psychology is a constantly changing field, you guys. We're always learning more information. What was PC to talk about 10 years ago is not PC to talk about now. If you want proof of that, I dare you watch some old Friends episodes on Netflix. Things change because what we are constantly learning about the human condition is changing. So psychology is constantly changing too. The DSM-5, which came out in 2013, is changing so much in terms of how to define and diagnose mental illness. Can we study mental processes too? Yes. There's such things as brain scans, but most people just opt for self-report questionnaires. Talk about using animals. Now, I would never put my little pug here in a scientific experiment, but I do know this to be true. I do know that animals do provide a simpler model because, let's face it, there's less variables going on in an animal and they're easier to control than humans are. Humans have all these different variables that go on their heads. They have how much they ate, what they consumed that day, depression, self-esteem. All these different things interact and tend to produce results in human beings. We have greater control over animals for that same reason. Or just stop growling. Ethical considerations. Well, for one thing, you can do certain things to animals that you can't do to humans. Readily available, it's easier to buy an animal than to compensate research participants. And sometimes you want to do research just on animals. It doesn't have to be animals in place of humans. Sometimes you just want to learn about animals. So, I normally ask at this point when psychology first began as a discipline. Well, it began around 1879 at the University of Leipzig with Wilhelm Wundt starting up his school of psychology called structuralism. We're going to talk about that later. But in truth, the origins of psychology lie in both philosophy and physiology. And a lot of people in ancient Greece did philosophy. So there's a lot of things philosophers did right, a lot of things that they did wrong. They started talking about how the mind and body are two different things. Descartes came up with the idea of dualism. John Locke came up with the idea of the tabula rasa, which means our brains are a blank slate when we are born, and experiences make us more human. They make up our conscious mind and who we are. Descartes, on the other hand, believed that the mind and the body were two different things. The mind is the spiritual, ethereal thing, and the body is mechanical. And that they interact. I don't think there's a real way to prove this one way or the other, but literature nowadays, or at least the literature that I know that's based on what I'm teaching, is monistic. As in, it treats the body and the mind as one thing. So the link between physiology and psychology is a scientific method, and empiricism, only looking at what we can see using the scientific method. Studying the nerve impulse as well. Psychology's roots are in philosophy and physiology, as we said before. However, philosophy is due to its questions about physiology and its use of the body. Now, the formal beginning of psychology as a scientific discipline. Like I said, 1879, Leipzig. We have the study of conscious experience, which is structuralism. Okay? Structuralism is the study of the conscious experience. What makes up the conscious experience? They use, and the University of Leipzig, Wilhelm Wundt headed this up, the concept of structuralism used introspection. Okay? Introspection is literally saying to look within. You ask people questions trying to figure out how they perceived certain things. Yeah, that didn't really work that way because different researchers produced different results. Remember this. I'm going to always put this on a test. The problem with structuralism is different researchers produce different results. Now, if you are going to do a scientific experiment, you want different researchers to produce the same results in a standardized method. Apparently, there's something wrong with introspection because that was not happening. It was not at all the perfect system. So Tishner took from Wundt's ideas and tried to refine it, but it still didn't work. Until they thought, okay, well, let's put the idea of studying the structure of the conscious experience aside, and let's talk about the function of the conscious experience, okay? We had the concept of a man named William James. He said, well, wait a second, y'all. Studying the structure of conscious experience is not leading results, but what about the function? Because, you know, how they see in biology, structure is always related to function. Well, we have William James's viewpoint. He believed, using Darwin's influence, that structure is related to function. So if we study the function of conscious experience, maybe we can yield better results as to what makes us successful as a race, as a human being. Functionalism didn't go down the drain so much as it evolved into new ideas and new things. Okay? Now, we know Darwin believed in the concept in his Origin of Species. He believed that the best and the strongest survive. Or people who are the best fit to their environment survive. Okay? So, let's say if I have the ability to run really fast, and I live on the Serengeti, and I'm being chased by cheetahs all day, that would probably serve me well. Or let's say I live in the jungle and I have the ability to camouflage. I'd be more likely to survive. Let's say if I have the ability to handle stress well and I worked as a stockbroker, the same principle would apply. Urza, quit snoring. My dog's name is Urza, by the way. He's a big snorer. Hopefully this will provide a little bit of cuteness to this lecture. Okay, so we have the fate of functionalism. We believe that functionalism stayed with us. We took Darwin's ideas, the idea that the best fit of our environment is what makes us survive, whether or not we are the best fit. And we took it to look at psychological concepts. Now I'm going to take this out of context a bit and talk about what we would need to survive in a post-apocalyptic world. Because right now the majority of us have the luxury of iPhones. We have the luxury of an education. Or rather the privilege of an education. Some of us have the ability to travel without, being preyed on by wild animals. For the most part, depending upon where in this state you live. But let's say if we lived in a world where we didn't have all those things. We didn't have shelter. We didn't have a roof over our heads. We didn't have people to protect us. We basically had no electricity. How would we survive? Well, sometimes in this society, the smartest people survive, or the biggest people who earn the most money or make the wisest decisions survive. But in a situation where all those things don't matter, where you only killed what you ate, ate what you killed, and you had to survive in groups, people who are good in groups, good teammates, good team players would survive and be the most successful. And people who were the biggest and the strongest might be successful. You see, there's a difference. People who are the better fit to their environment do tend to survive. A different environment would lead to different successful traits. William James spent a lot of time talking about the function of human behavior. Now, psychoanalysts came around the turn of the century. Now, here's the thing. Before psychoanalysis came into being, people in the mental health system, it's kind of like prison today. It's easy to get into and it's hard as heck to get out of. And you weren't treated like a human being. So, Freud had this idea that, wait a second, maybe we need to talk to these people like they're human beings and not like animals. Maybe that might be more effective. So, he decided to develop a theory, whereas to simply let their patients talk about their problems. So Freud got together with his student and colleague, Jung. That's Jung, Jung. It's a weird German spelling, but still a spelling. They had a patient named Anna O. They let her talk about her problems, and all of a sudden she felt this catharsis, which is this release of energy, this sense of relief. And with that and several other patients, they developed a model of therapy, or a model of personality, in which there are three main types: the id, the ego, and the superego. These are three personality structures. Okay? The id is the primal personality structure. It wants what it wants, and it wants it now, and demands instant gratification. Okay? Freud came up with all this. The ego, which developed, of course, around the age of 1 or 2, is when the mind develops a way of figuring out what it can and cannot get away with. The id is like your mental accountant. And the superego is a sense of guilt, a conscience, which is responsible for telling us what we should or should not do. So while the id tells us what we want, sometimes we're not even aware of what it wants. The ego tries to rationalize and tell us what we can and cannot have based on the reality of the situation. And the superego makes us feel guilt when we do something that is not in keeping with the demands of society. Okay. So Freud believed that we had a conscious mind and an unconscious mind. Now, like an iceberg, this is Freud's big metaphor, the iceberg. We have a conscious mind at the tip of the iceberg, and the unconscious mind, which exists under the surface, which is far vaster and far deeper. Now, he believed that the primary things that go into the unconscious mind are things that we're A, not aware of and don't want to be aware of, and B, they tend to be mostly about sex or sexual desires. Freud believed that everything that motivates us was related to sex in some biological way. Now, let me explain why that makes sense. Okay? If Freud tells us that sex primarily motivates our behavior, he's saying the primary motivator of our behavior is to pass on our genes. Okay? Passing on our genes is our primary, our primary purpose in life, so it makes sense that, at least on some level, it would motivate the majority of our other behaviors in our lives. Freud was a little unconventional, but what he did for the mental health industry and what he did to help people was so outstanding that people take at least some of his ideas and move with them. He was the first person to come up with a theory of psychoanalysis, a theory of personality. The idea that our actions and our behaviors can occasionally be unaware of. We can be unaware of those things. The idea that, we're not aware of why we do certain things or why we feel certain things because it's in the unconscious mind. It's an unconscious conflict. That was outstanding because Freud believed that this constant struggle between the id and the superego, or the id and the ego, is the main cause of our behaviors and our struggles and our, what Freud called anxiety. That was a big thing, y'all. That was a big thing. Because no one else thought of that before him. So Freud, his theories continue in spirit, but not necessarily literally today. But he's still important. Still very important. I guess one of the main things I want to emphasize here is that Freud believed that the id and the superego, the conflict between what we biologically want and what society tells us we can have and can't have, conflict. And a lot of our problems come from that. So I want you to take from that as you will. A lot of people who took from Freud's ideas didn't believe that sex was the primary proponent of behavior. Now, behaviorism was far more successful from an empirical standpoint. Behaviorism was far more successful. Freud talked about things that we could not see. Behaviorism was all about what we could see, what we could physically observe. Okay? Started off with Watson and Skinner. They didn't agree with the fact that, oh, well, okay, I have to go and, look at what's in the person's mind. Behaviorists don't believe that the mind even exists. Thoughts to radical behaviorists are just subvocal behaviors, that's it. So there's several different ways of looking at this. I'm going to start with Pavlov. Pavlov did research on dogs, not like My Little Pug, big dogs, like Rottweilers. He did little digestive things on them where they put little tubes in their mouths, right? And what he noticed is that dogs salivated not when just food was presented to them, but also when... Cutters won't stop snoozing. But also when the bell would ring right before the food was presented. Because they associated the bell with the food. In this case, you associated two things. The bell with the food. That formed a conditioned association. Okay? That's called classical conditioning. So the dog automatically associated the bell with the food and salivated. So Pavlov was the first person. He won a Nobel Prize in this. He wasn't trying to, but he did. And he got a lot of accolades for the idea that animals as well as humans can associate two things. Now, you probably think this isn't true, but you probably think this is, wow, this is so much information. Here's the thing. You already do it and you don't even know it. You watch videos, you watch beer commercials. You see beautiful women in bikinis, and you're like, oh man, I gotta buy that beer. Because a lot of people use sex to sell products. Skinner was another guy who used rats in a box and had them press levers in order to get food. That was a big thing. Another thing that was learned was operant conditioning. So while Pavlov talked about conditioning automatic associations, operant conditioning talks about voluntary behavior. For example, I'm going to walk outside right now and freeze my body off. Okay? Yes, I tried to censor myself right there. If I go outside and I freeze, I'm probably not going to want to go back outside. Okay? So my voluntary behavior, what I can willingly do, is changed. So behaviorism isn't exactly about free will. Behaviorists believe that free will doesn't exist. We are all acting out conditioned associations of our behavior. Everything we do is a result of our learning. Which I think is interesting, but I'm not sure if it's true from a holistic standpoint. Let's move on. Gestalt psychology. The Germans are back. The whole is not the sum of its parts. Well, that's one thing for sure. And they believe when it comes to sensing an object, the whole, how we perceive an object, is basically how we smell it, see it, taste it, whatever. This is basically a legacy of structuralism. Okay? So the idea is that we perceive something not just with our five senses, but we perceive it differently than each of our five senses combined. Gestalt psychology moved on to humanism later. So structuralism said that human beings broke down conscious experience into basic elements. Gestalt psychologists focus on sensory elements being brought together to form something new of the perception of a stimulus. For instance, if I grabbed Urza right now and smelled her, I could touch her, feel her, I can smell her, I can even lick her. Like, bleh, bleh, pug taste, bleh. I can hear her. These are all different emotions, but I might perceive her differently if I just heard, touch, or felt her one at a time. I recognize her differently. So do you think it's better to study the elements of perception or study the entire thing at once? Well, if I perceive something differently, if I perceive it by seeing it, smelling it, tasting it, whatever, I mean, it would be easier, I think, to say the entire story. Or is there no lick? No licking. Let's talk about humanistic psychology for a second. Now, if I told you your behavior was a result of sexual impulses like Freud, you might be a little offended. I know I would be. Now, if someone told you that your behavior was a result of a pre-programmed or a learned association, your behaviors weren't spontaneous out of choice or value, that might offend you too. So humanism came out as a result of those two ideologies conflicting. They wanted to believe in the concept of free will, and neither Freud nor Skinner's approaches actually led them in that direction. So humanism is not a research field. It's mostly a field that is coming from a result of the negative energy towards the psychoanalysis and behaviorism. So humanism psychology did a lot for us. It helped revolutionize the therapy industry, the idea of making it client-centered. Okay? Humanism decided to focus on helping people meet their goals rather than merely fixing their past, trying to figure out what went wrong in their past or figuring out the conditions of their behavior. People want to feel in control, hence the emphasis on free will. They discuss things about like self-actualization. What does it take to meet our full potential in life? But here's the problem. Your full potential in life and my full potential in life, even if we're aware of it, will not be the same. And they'll change throughout the course of our lifetimes. So is it possible to empirically measure a self-actualization potential? No! Let's talk about psychology today. There's no single theoretical approach that is more effective than the others. The behaviorism and cognitive behavioral therapy certainly is taking a high point. But we also still have the remnants, and honestly, there's still some good remnants from psychoanalysis used today. Except instead of focusing on sex as the primary determinant of our behavior and focusing on our childhood as ways of explaining why our behavior is, we focus more on current life problems in psychoanalysis. So there's several, each with its own approach. Let's talk about cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology is the study of the brain, almost as a computer. This is kind of explaining why we perceive things the way they do. You know the whole dress fiasco on Facebook a while back? Is the dress blue? Is it black? Is it gold? That's a subject for the cognitive psychologists and the perceptual psychologists. Why do we perceive things the way they do? So we go back into Gestalt psychology and structuralism, and we pull a lot of the research from that and expand on it. Developmental psychology talks about development from womb to tomb. What factors influence development? What makes us successful at developing? That's poorly phrased. How we develop as people. What are some developmental milestones that we need to address in order to develop successfully? Very essential information. Social psychology. This is the study of not groups. So sociology is the study of groups. Social psychology is the study of how individuals behave in groups, such as mob mentality, cults, social influence, obedience. That's a big one. That's why I brought up cults. Personality psychology talks about the opposite of social psychology, how individuals differ from each other. So these four are considered experimental or basic fields: cognitive, developmental, social, personality. I mentioned that we do research on these things, but we don't apply them necessarily to a therapy setting, which means these are all experimental. Okay, let's move on. So experimental psychology covers all those four. We also have biological psychology. Okay? Biological psychology talks about how the structure of the brain and the nervous system affects our behavior. For instance, if I have, people who suffer with depression will know this, if I have an overabundance of serotonin, is my brain going to look the same as someone who has very little serotonin? No. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter which communicates the sleep-wake cycle. If I don't have enough serotonin, I'm probably not going to sleep very well, and my moods will not be regulated the same as a person who has a normal amount of serotonin. Biological psychology asks and answers questions such as this. Now, all those are considered basic research. We apply them, but not literally. We're not doing research on therapies to improve that. I mean, we can. But this is not something that we use directly on people. Okay? We take these and we apply them in a medical setting. This is mostly research done for the sake of research. Okay? Biology, cognitive, developmental, social, personality. This is all research done for the sake of research. Okay. Now, I'm explaining to you guys something a little different. There's also applied psychology. Okay? This is slightly different. While experimental psychology is research done for the sake of research, applied psychology, experimental psychology is research done for the sake of research. Applied psychology can use experimental or basic psychology. Okay? We can use it, but we use it as kind of like in our lit reviews. We use it to explain or support some of our points. But applied psychology, by far, is used to figure out what works on humans. Clinical psychology, for example, is how to diagnose and treat people with major mental disorders, such as dissociative identity disorder, eating disorders is a big one, major depression, schizophrenia. Clinical psychology is meant to kind of attack those issues. Counseling psychology, on the other hand, is designed to deal with basic problems of living, marital issues, how to get along with other people, things like that. Problems of adjustment. Now, when we do research on those two fields, what we do is we try to do research on what therapies work well, how to affect our behavior. Now, there's another two different types of applied psychology we need to talk about. Educational and school psychology. Talk about educational psychology. We're trying to improve the structure of schools in the educational system. Okay? We're trying to do research to train teachers, to implement programs like Common Core. You can blame that on the educational psychologists. School psychology, on the other hand, deals with individual problems between students. Industrial organizational psychology talks about dealing with how people get along with each other and in the workplace area, and how to be more productive. How do we get people to be more productive in the long term? Writing safety manuals, That's very important. Now, sports psychology, on the other hand, is talking about how people get along in a competitive field, how to increase endurance, psychological endurance in the field. That's very essential. So all those things, clinical, counseling, educational, school, industrial organizational psychology, and sports psychology, those are all applied disciplines. This is how we deal with what therapies, what treatments, what programs work directly on people. What works, what doesn't, what works for different situations. Then there's more specialties. Honestly, these kind of count as applied, some of these count as experimental. Health psychology, for example, that is applied to how, it's kind of like biological psychology, but applied specifically to health. What behaviors cause good psychological well-being? Smoking. That's an addictive behavior. Does it help you? No. Health psychology will talk about ways to deal with that. Positive psychology talks about how to increase behavior with positive thinking. Forensic psychology talks about how to educate law enforcement, expert witnesses, things like that, how to be a good witness in the field. How to educate cops and law enforcement on the nature of mental illness. Because I've met several cops who don't know what autism is. That's not necessarily true of everyone. But some people don't know what autism is. No one knows how to deal with certain people. Certain people, a lot of people don't know how to deal with. So that's why it's very important to have people educating them. Try to figure out how criminal behavior is affected by your past. Aspects of lie detectors, telling when someone's lying or not. That's very big in forensic psychology. Also determining when the insanity plea would stand up in the court of law. Then there's artificial intelligence. This is kind of like cognitive